We're in the middle of a series called Daniel, Faithful in a Broken World, where we're exploring the ancient Hebrew text of Daniel in the Old Testament. And even though this book was written thousands of years ago, it's actually very relevant to our context today. There's been a lot of chatter, especially in recent years, amongst church planners and pastors in our area about how America is actually now considered to be a post-Christian society. Have any of you heard any of this discussion? Maybe a little bit. Now, that doesn't mean that Christianity is a thing of the past or that there aren't any Christians anymore in the West. I mean, look around, we're here, and there's actually tons of vibrant churches all over a city, even like Portland, with the type of city that we are. Think of the Good News Today event last summer. I mean, just thousands of people who love Jesus in our city alone. However, what it does mean is that the secularization of American culture is almost complete. That what happened at more of an academic elite level decades ago in our country is actually normalized more now to the mainstream culture at large, which means that for most young people growing up in our society right now, living on Snapchat and Apple TV and Xbox, it's pretty easy for them to experience life growing up where Christianity isn't really on their radar at all, and it's easy to just sort of live a secular life. And so the question is, how do we navigate that? How do you and I, as followers of Jesus, living in a post-Christian society, live our lives? And I believe Daniel really speaks into this. It's very helpful. And the text today, I apologize in advance, the text today is a little bit on the long side, and I'm going to fly through it because it's a really long chapter. So hold on to your seats, perk up, please don't lose me, tune in. You can take a nap later this afternoon. Here we go, Daniel chapter 3, verse 1. We're just going to start by reading it. It says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide. A cubit, by the way, is about 1.5 feet. So picture a 90-foot tall image or statue. Keep reading. And he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials, redundant captain, assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then, verse 4, the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and people of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, good grief. And I love how, for example, in a city like Portland, we have a lot of great music, a lot of, garage bands, and they're always trying to incorporate these experimental instruments. Like 10 or 15 years ago, it was the guitar with all the rock bands. And now these days, it's the mandolin and the viola and all these instruments. My question to you, though, is, but who's your zitherist? You know what I'm saying? Here's a picture just for your indulgences of an ancient zither, a stringed instrument. It's you want to be cool? Who's your zitherer, okay? Man, keep reading. Look at verse 5. As soon as you hear all that music, they say, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Verse 6, whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So if you know the story, King Nebuchadnezzar, sometimes I call him Nebi for short, I might do that today. At the time, Nebuchadnezzar is the most powerful man in the ancient world. He was at the head of a global military superpower that had conquered Israel and many other nations and taken them into captivity in Babylon. And he decides to set up this image or this statue, and it doesn't say exactly what the statue is of, whether it's a statue of Nebuchadnezzar himself or whether it's a statue of the Babylonian gods. Most scholars actually believe it was sort of an image or statue that represented Babylon, the nation state, or a representation of Babylon's power, kind of like the national symbol of Babylon at the time. So what they are worshiping, what they are bowing down to, is the power of the entity that is Babylon, the greatest nation on earth at that time. And all of Babylon, it says, is spread out in front of this image. That's the meaning of the phrase repeated, the satraps, the prefects, the magistrates. It's kind of like saying the who's who in Babylon at that time, whether it was Babylonians or Assyrians or Egyptians or Hebrew. Everybody is there and they all bow down when the music plays. Or do they? Look at verse 8. At this time, some Chaldeans, it could also be translated astrologers, came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever." Suck-ups. Verse 10, "Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego by name, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." And think about this. This is crazy. So in a sea of people, picture thousands, probably tens of thousands of people. All of the nation, in a sense, is there. And out of all of them, just 3 Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refuse to bow down and worship this image of Babylon. Now, they're quiet about it. They don't protest. We don't read about any bullhorns or sandwich board signs. There's no march or rally. There's no hashtag we're aware of, like hashtag never Nebuchadnezzar or anything like that. In fact, the king doesn't even see it at first, but the Chaldeans, who, if you remember the story, they're essentially the co-workers to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they rat them out. And we assume here this is like infighting, office politics. The Chaldean astrologers are jealous that 3 Hebrews, not Babylonians, have risen to the upper ranks of government, so they throw them under the bus to get the Jews in trouble. Now, for those of you thinking, where's Daniel in all of this? Just those 3 didn't bow down? Does that mean Daniel bowed down? No. In fact, the last line of chapter 2 said Daniel himself remained in the royal court. The author makes sure to note that. And so we're pretty sure that Daniel is actually not here in this scene or this event. He's back at the capital serving in the royal court. Now, keep reading, verse 13. "Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, 'Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe,'" this thing's on repeat like a bad song, right? "And all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made," very good, "but," and don't miss this, "if you do not worship it," he says, "you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace." He's just reminding them what's at stake, okay? And he says, "Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Talk about megalomania. "I'm more powerful than your God," right? Notice the anger, the condescending, rash talk, the boasting from a political leader. Personally, I'm just so grateful we've evolved past this in modern times. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter." And guys, watch this. This is striking. "If we are thrown into the blazing furnace," they say, "the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand." In other words, actually, our God's more powerful than you are. "But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Whoa. Think of the courage it took to say that. And again, I want you to notice, because we can all learn from this, they don't yell. They don't scream. They just say, "Okay, do your worst." And they're respectful. They call him your majesty. They acknowledge his leadership, his power, but they say, "I understand that's what you're asking everyone else to do. Because of the God we worship, we can't. I'm sorry, but no, we won't." They're respectful. Now, keep in mind, this is not the 21st century Western secular world. This is 6th century BC, ancient Near East. This is not like things are today in our culture. This is a society where it was pluralism to the core. It's a world where spirituality and religion and politics were all mixed up together, along with a bunch of other stuff. And there's no separation of church and state. It's all together. So the king, the gods of Babylon, the nations of Babylon, and worship, it's all kind of put together in a giant pot. And the 3 Jews in the story, they aren't loud or disrespectful or snarky at all. But make no mistake, for them to not bow down to the image of Babylon was not only a very subversive act, but it was a threat to the status quo, and a very dangerous one, which is why. Look at verse 19. "Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, which translates from Hebrew to English as extra hot, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. I love that he orders some of the, quote, strongest soldiers in his army. Like, how would you feel being one of the not-so-strong Babylonian soldiers? Like, you just watch as The Rock and Vin Diesel tie up and haul these guys. I have compassion for them a little bit. Verse 21, so these men wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, good grief, this author likes lists, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. This is very violent for a Sunday morning. I mean, think about the intensity of this. The fire is so hot that just those strong, select soldiers who threw them into the fire, once they got close, they burst into flames or melted. Very intense. And of course, now the not-so-strong soldiers are like, turns out it was our day, right? But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they refuse to bow down, and they're thrown into the fire for their defiance. But that's not the end of the story, is it? Look at verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, hey, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw in the fire? And they replied, certainly, Your Majesty. He said, look, I see 1, 2, 3, 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Fascinating story. And the million-dollar question, of course, is, who is the 4th person in the fire? Well, Christian tradition, of course, has always said it's Jesus, because let's be honest, that's like how we like to answer almost every question as Christians, and that's not bad. The Aramaic word here in the original language means a spiritual being. A paragraph or 2 later, it reads as an angel in the original text, and so a lot of scholars do connect it to the angel of the Lord who shows up in tons of other Old Testament stories. Those of you Bible nerds here in the room, by the way, if you've never done this study before, I encourage you to do your own study sometime of all the occurrences of the, quote, angel of the Lord. In the Old Testament, tons of evidence that the angel of the Lord is the second member of the Trinity, or in other words, the pre-incarnate Christ before he shows up in the 1st century as Jesus of Nazareth in the flesh. But whether or not it was an apparition or appearing of Jesus before he came as Jesus of Nazareth and was born of the Virgin Mary, or whether it was some kind of other angel sent by God, the point is that God was obviously with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego right there in the fires. God was protecting them and keeping them safe. Look at what happens, verse 26. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, the gang shows up. And royal advisors, they crowd around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Check it out. Not only were they unharmed, like there wasn't even, it says, the smell of fire on them. Really? Like not even just like a little post-campfire smoke in your hoodie, like nothing, right? Verse 28, then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. So now he actually starts to worship the one true God. He says, they trusted in him and defied the king's command. I love how Nebuchadnezzar refers to himself in the 3rd person, right? That's so Kanye of him. And they were willing, he says, to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. And so now he starts to have respect for them. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. So he's still just a little bit far from the heart of God, just maybe. You know, and now I command you guys to actually worship their God, and if you don't, we'll chop you into pieces and like masochistic Edward Scissorhands gone wrong kind of thing. But essentially, what he's doing is he's giving them legal protection. It's a way to legalize Jewish worship of Yahweh, the Hebrew God, in the Babylonian Empire. This is a very good thing. It will allow God's people to worship him freely. And then finally, the last verse, verse 30, then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So they get a promotion from this miraculous event. And, if this was a movie, at this point, the camera would then pan over to the Chaldean astrologers who are, grinding their teeth and shaking their fists and ripping their clothes, and it'd maybe go back to those not so strong Babylonian soldiers who were left, and they're lifting weights, and everyone lived happily ever after, right? Wrong. There's a lot more that's going to happen in the book of Daniel. We'll get to that, but first, what do we do with that? With what we just read, and thanks for bearing with me. We were flying through that. What's the application of this for our lives? What does this matter to you and I? Now, before we talk about that, before we can get to application, I want to spend a few moments addressing those of you here in the room who are maybe new to this whole church thing. I have some words to say to you first. And then after that, I want to talk for a few minutes with those of you in the room who have been a part of church for a really long time. And then we'll get to the application. So first, for those of you who are somewhat new to this whole church thing, I just wanted to acknowledge that the Bible is a really weird book. And if you're sitting there, and as we read about this miraculous event, if you're sitting there struggling with the idea that three men could be in a fiery furnace fire and not be burned, I get that. I've been there personally. At this church, we do believe that the accounts of the Bible are true, that this stuff isn't myth or fairy tale or metaphor, that the historical events, as they're described in the Bible, are true, which means we, of course, believe in the occurrence of miracles in the natural world. And by the way, for Christians, if you believe just the opening lines of the Bible in Genesis, that God created the world, which is kind of a big miracle. If you believe that God created everything from nothing, then stuff like three men in a fire unburned or animals of every kind going onto an ark, that stuff's like child's play in comparison, right? If you believe God created everything. But the real question on miracles at the heart of Christianity, at the heart of the gospel, if you're new to church, is actually the resurrection. Later in the New Testament, this idea that Jesus died for our sins and the sins of the world on the cross, and 3 days later literally rose from the dead, having victory over sin and death. In fact, the New Testament argues that you cannot be a Christian unless you believe the resurrection really happened. That's the very crux of what it means to be a Christian. And what I want to convey to you today, if you're new to all of this, is that there's actually very good evidence that supports many of the miraculous events in the historical narrative of the Bible, but especially lots of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth in the first century. I want you to understand, Christianity does not ask or require you to check your brain at the door. In fact, it's quite the opposite. There are astrophysicists and mathematicians who I know or whom I have met who have become Christians because of the data, because of the evidence. And the reason why millions down throughout history of countless PhDs and doctorates and masters, even on into the modern world, believe that the Bible makes the best sense of the world around us. The real question at the center of the gospel is, do you believe that Jesus really did die for your sins out of love for you and that he rose from the grave 3 days later? That's a decision that you make in your heart, but it's also a decision you make with your rational mind. And that's the only way to follow Jesus. You believe, you decide, you put your faith in that. And so I just want to say, wherever you're at in that process, we're glad that you're here. We encourage you to come on the weekends, to ask questions, to study with us. Ask us for more resources if you want to dive deeper into that. Wherever you're at in that journey, we're glad that you're here and you're listening and studying. We really encourage you to use your mind and think this stuff through. And if you're at a point where you're thinking, yeah, I think I do believe, I think I am actually ready to be a Christian. I do believe in the resurrection. I just haven't, quote, jumped off the cliff yet. I haven't gone all in yet. We'll even give you an opportunity later today when this gathering is over to make a decision to follow Jesus. But with that said, now a quick caveat or disclaimer to everyone in the room who's been a part of the church for a long time as we read this story in Daniel chapter 3 today. Out of curiosity, how many of you here actually grew up in the church or going to church in some fashion? Okay, a lot of us. I did personally. How many of you can remember back to those days of Sunday school? How many of you remember the felt board? Anyone? Okay, the felt board, it was a thing of glory, right? Like iPad has nothing on the felt board. Modern projectors, nothing, right? And if you were around back in those days, this story in Daniel chapter 3 was actually one of the really good ones on that felt board, wasn't it? I mean, you had the felt board megalomania king, and he usually had a braided beard. And then you had the felt board Babylonian soldiers. You had the felt flames that you could put the soldiers in the flames. They fall in. And then you could put Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You can even put felt board Jesus in the flames next to the three of them. And it's like, wow, even the lamb on felt board Jesus' shoulders doesn't burn in the fire. It is a miracle. It was a good one, right? If you remember. Now, the reality, of course, this is not a children's story. In fact, on a serious note, I think in the West, where we're considerably free of any physical persecution, we tend to tame down and dumb down this stuff to sort of a felt board Sunday school happy level, because if you actually read it at face value, it's quite provocative and disturbing and uncomfortable for the status quo. However, because we live in a post-Christian society like we do, I actually find a story like this to be very helpful and encouraging for how to navigate the world around us. So let's talk about that. What is this story really about, and how does it apply to our world today? If you're taking notes, 3 things. First, this story is about faithfulness to God amid cultural pressure. When everything is at stake, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down or to commit idolatry under tremendous political, religious, and social pressure. And in America, today the pressures may not look exactly the same as Daniel's day, but we do have pressures today in our culture, don't we, when it comes to following Jesus? One of these pressures at a very basic level, and I'll start with this one because it's so relevant from the text we read. One of the pressures we have as Americans is nationalism, which historically the church in America is susceptible to politically. In Daniel chapter 3, their form of nationalism was literally forcing people to bow down to this golden image. We don't have anything like that. No one's forcing us to literally worship some, image of the red, white, and blue. That's not the case. However, nationalism can be a pitfall for followers of Jesus today in our country. And please don't mishear me. I'm not talking about patriotism. Patriotism, being passion for or love for, loyalty toward your country. That can be a very honorable, very noble thing. But when I say nationalism, what I mean is when you mix politics and religion together in a way in which the lines start to blur and the hope isn't quite on Jesus. There's a very real type of nationalism in America where if you're not careful, you can subtly mix and convolute religion and politics together, where the temptation is to swap out the kingdom of God for your own political party, and or to swap out Jesus the Messiah for your political leader or candidate. And there can be a pitfall of then pinning a lot of the hope of you and your family, your livelihood, your future on that. And the reality is that as followers of Jesus, our, quote, allegiance, of course, is first and foremost to Jesus as king. Now, at the same time, we're American citizens. And our calling is to be in the world, but not of it. So we can't retreat. We don't become anarchists or anything like that. We participate and engage and be a part. We vote, and we're American citizens. We pray for, respect leadership. We recognize their power, okay? But at the same time, there will be times as Americans when, just like the young men in Babylon encountered, where we will face legislation or leadership or pressure that does not line up with the commands of Jesus and his heart for the world. And what then? Where it's not so simple as just voting along your political party lines, and it becomes messy, and there can be a temptation for us to just simplify and make it easy. And in those times, to be faithful to God means we must wrestle as the community of faith. We need wisdom to together wrestle on what it means to stay faithful to Jesus and his way of life as laid out in the scriptures before us, especially when there's dissonance between that and the direction that maybe the leadership in our country is urging us. So there's a pressure of nationalism, but also there's a pressure of pluralism. in our society today, similar to the pluralism in Babylon back then. Pluralism, of course, being the acceptance of multiple moralities, multiple systems of worship. I was just in Austin, Texas last weekend for a work trip, and Austin's a very similar city to Portland. We're walking around, we're having a great day that first day, seeing some of the city, and there's this giant sign at a famous spot that says, "Always welcome." But they took the word always and they put a space in the middle, so it's two words, always welcome, implying always are welcome, here in Austin. And there's something about that that resonates. It's very similar to Portland. There's something I really appreciate about that mentality of the warmth and welcome to people of all faith backgrounds, all ethnicities, all different ventures of life that they're coming from. I love that, but we all know spiritually there's something going on deeper there, right? When you really get into morality and philosophy as well, things start to get murky real fast. And I think that really sums up a lot of the ethos of a city like Portland in which we live, where it's all about tolerance and open-mindedness and the acceptance of many ways, many paths at a societal mainstream level. Even in the story we read, I want you to think about this. Nebuchadnezzar, he didn't have a problem with the Jews worshiping Yahweh. To begin with. He didn't have a problem with that. He just wanted them to also worship Babylon and the gods of Babylon whenever the zither played, whenever the music started. He wanted them to also bow. You can worship Yahweh, great. Just at these moments, also worship and acknowledge our God and power. And they said, sorry, we can't do it. And so in a culture like ours, my question is, what happens when our calling is to worship one God, Jesus, but our God makes these truth claims that in their very essence are exclusive truth claims? How do we follow a faith preaching that not every path does lead to life? That eternal life is actually only found in Jesus and his way as laid out in the scriptures. And even though the Christian invitation is the most inclusive invitation ever, you guys have to understand this. The Christian invitation is so inclusive. Do you understand? What is the invitation of the gospel? Come as you are. Whatever background, whatever you've done, whatever your experience or outlook or perspective has been, if you come to the cross of Jesus, you can experience radical grace and salvation in him. Wherever you're at in the spectrum, come to Jesus. You can find salvation in him. But you can't stay that way. You have to allow God's presence in your life to then begin to transform you and I into the people he created us to be. And that's where things get tricky with some of the message and ethos of our culture. There's tremendous pressure in our culture to at times cave and go with that undercurrent that is modern plurality. That how you are, you can stay that way forever. Whatever you believe, you can believe that forever. It's fine. It's your choice. It's up to you. That's all around us, which leads me to the next point, if you're taking notes. The story we read today is a story about counting the cost of godly resistance in a broken world. I can't imagine what was going through the mind of these three young men when those big, strong soldiers were dragging them toward the fire. I mean, they'd been so courageous. They'd made their stand before the king and others, and they'd said, God will protect us when we get thrown in the fire. But they say, even if he doesn't, we won't bow down. And could you imagine when the rubber hit the road and they're actually being carried toward that fire? Unless God does protect them, death is imminent. I mean, there's a very high cost to living faithfully to God for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Babylonian culture, and there is a, quote, cost of living the way of Jesus in a culture like ours. Now, in our culture, it might not be the threat of murder or cremation for worshiping God like it was literally in their story and context, but there certainly are places in the world today, by the way, where that is still very much the case. You do realize that, right? I work for an anti-human trafficking nonprofit. We're in 16 countries where we operate around the world, and there are some places we have people on the ground where they absolutely have to be conscious of the dangers associated with simply being a Christian in that country. And there's places I travel to for work where I go, where I have to consider the danger for visiting there as a Christian and also in light of the type of work that I do. And that's something new for me and our family to navigate. However, let's be honest. In America, the primary pressure is not physical danger, but there is a very real social pressure, isn't there? There is a social shame and a social cost for following Jesus in a place like Portland and a culture like ours, isn't there? Like, for example, just the way that I'm wired. I'm a very style-conscious person and trend-conscious individual. I'm a creative. I'm an artist. I'm into photography. I do commercial freelance photography on the side of my anti-human trafficking work. I also like cinema and television. I enjoy many aspects of culture. But for example, like the way I talk, like this just talk about the way I talk. Like I don't say the F word, okay? Nor lots of other curse words, and I'm not perfect in that. God forgive me, I'm a work in progress. But like in some circles I roll with, like when I'm working in secular environments, like not using certain language and certain lines that everyone else around me is using, like sometimes, let's be honest, that makes me weird, okay? Like, whoa, straight edge Christian hipster guy, like, okay, and like, are you judging me for how I'm talking? And like, right, it's awkward. Let me get more awkward, okay? Because I'm a follower of Jesus, I've made a personal decision. I'm not putting this on anyone else or telling you have to make this decision. I've made a personal decision to not watch the television show Game of Thrones, okay? And I love like medieval warfare and dragons and fantasy, so it's difficult. You see like commercials and like, oh, that looks fun, and everyone's talking about it. But for example, the reason I made that decision, and again, I know this is controversial even in church, but I am gonna go there, okay? I have made this decision because from what I've heard of the content, especially visually, I've decided, that's not going to be helpful for me and my desire to live sexually pure and faithful to my wife and free of lust toward other people who are not my wife. And so for me, it's not going to be helpful to watch that, right? And again, I'm not judging you if you do watch that show. This is not an indictment. And I know you can do the thing where like, oh, I watch it with my spouse, and we're like waiting there guessing for when the near pornographic nudity will jump up, and then we'll like look away and skip ahead and stuff. And like, I know, you can play that game, and it's not about rules, it's about grace, right? This is not me judging. If you watch it, I don't judge you. I don't, okay? For me. Let's get one thing straight though, okay? When I'm in circles where like they're talking like, have you seen the new GOT and like, blah, blah, blah episode? And I'm like, no. And they ask me why. If I don't lie, my answer is, well, because of the naked people. Like, let's get one thing straight. That culturally does not make me cool, right? Amongst many other things. Like it goes way deeper, okay? Like for example, I was a virgin until I was married, okay? And culturally, thank you. That's awkward to talk about in front of all of you right now. I appreciate that support. But right, like think about it. Culturally, what does that make me culturally? Freak show, right? Like in our day and age. Amongst many other things I could talk about. But like many of you in this room, okay, we need to acknowledge that we all navigate that. And like many of you in this room, for example, I know what it's like to have a neighbor immediately not be interested in any kind of deep friendship with me just because I profess Jesus. I know what it's like to have someone assume that I'm judgmental or bigoted toward LGBTQ just because I'm a Christian, when in fact, I have multiple LGBTQ friends who know that I love them and would call me a good friend. We spend time together. We live in a city where there is a stigma and reaction to Christians, and so there's a cost to count. Are we willing to suffer shame or embarrassment and endure social pressure to follow and experience life in Jesus, and so that others may come to know his love? Do you truly believe that what Jesus has to offer is better than what the culture around you has to offer? And is better than any kind of social acceptance that society could offer us or tempt us with? Because that's at the heart of it. One of my favorite chapters in the whole Bible is Psalm 63, where David the psalmist, he bursts forth in worship. And there's one verse where he says, because your love is better than life, my lips will praise you. I love that. He's saying, man, like God, your love is better than life itself. He's essentially saying, like, if I had to choose between my life as I know it and experiencing and walking in the love of God, I would choose the love of God. Because my life is temporary. One day I'm going to die, but the love of God and the promises of God go on forever, and only that can truly satisfy the deepest longings of the soul. And you guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they lived this reality because they were willing to trade it all in. They were literally willing to give up their very lives to worship and know this God. They had discovered the secret that life in him really is far better than any kind of social acceptance or any of the fleeting pleasures that the world or culture has to offer us. The question is, have we discovered that secret? That there really is nothing better than the love of God. And what are we willing to risk to live faithfully for this God? Are we willing to endure social shame for this Jesus? Are we willing to be the only one, to not go clubbing at night on that work trip with everyone else? Are we willing to be the only one, in your work circle who doesn't gossip and demean your boss behind her back when everyone else is, even though that makes them suspicious of you, that you're not joining in on it? Are you willing to be the only one who doesn't get plastered at the bachelorette party? Are you willing to be the only one who doesn't sleep with your girlfriend on your basketball team, who doesn't seemingly sleep with their girlfriend? And the reason I have to say that is because a lot of that's just talk, let's be honest. Do we believe that Jesus' love is better than what the world has to offer? And if so, are we willing, one day at a time, to lovingly, quietly, and respectfully live different under pressure? Are we willing to resist and not conform to what society's trying to make us into? Not in a way that's preachy or self-righteous or judgmental or rude. I love, and again, we have to get this, guys. It can't be lived out in an obnoxious way. Obnoxiousness is not what brings people to Jesus, okay? I love how in this story, again, they're respectful, your majesty. Say, look, we understand you're asking everyone to do this personally because the God we worship, he's so great, we can't. We believe he's the only one. So I know everyone else, we can't. We understand the consequences, sorry, but no. It's this quiet, respectful resistance to the status quo, this refusal to just drift down the same stream that everyone's swimming. And here's the encouraging part. If you do believe that God's love and goodness is better than what culture around you has to offer, and you're willing to live that way, whenever you fight that battle, whenever you carry that burden, whenever you wear that social shame, there is a promise that God will meet you in that in a special way. Which leads me to the last thought. This story is about the presence of God in our suffering. It's really interesting to me that this story is about a group of minorities, 3 Hebrews in Babylon, who are thrown into a furnace by an evil dictator. You know why that's interesting to me? Because the very reason that many modern people do not believe in God today is in fact because of the many, quote, furnaces of the last 100 years. Because of Auschwitz and Nazi Germany and countless other atrocities and genocides that we've witnessed in human history, oftentimes done by people in the name of Jesus, who, of course, again, the temptations of nationalism, have taken Scripture and totally warped and twisted it to fit their own political agendas. However, nonetheless, it's this dilemma that so many of our neighbors encounter in our world today where they say, how could there possibly be a good and loving God when there's so much suffering in the world? And guys, understand, the answer to that very question is right in this text. There is a 4th person in the fire. I want you to think about the power of that and the message it sends about God. That he's standing there in the blazing furnace beside them. Because let's be honest, he could have swooped down like a Marvel superhero with a cape and snatched them up before they dropped in the fire. He could have done that, he's God. He could have swung like Tarzan and whoosh and, and all that. But instead, he's standing there next to them in the public display of humiliation and martyrdom. He's standing right there next to them in the fiery flames. Guys, this is the answer to the problem of suffering. It's not that God causes the affliction. In the story, God didn't set up the furnace. God didn't cause this suffering. It's caused by an evil king who decides to do violent sin against other people in his rebellion to the living God. However, our God is the God who doesn't abandon us in our rebellion and sin, nor in our human plight and suffering, but he's the God who suffers with us. That's at the very heart of the gospel, that Jesus is Emmanuel, meaning God with us, present with us. He steps into the story to join in our pain. He's the God who goes into the furnace before us. There's an awesome quote by the old revivalist, Jonathan Edwards. He's reflecting on the scene where Jesus is praying in the garden, and his prayer is so intense that he sweats droplets of blood, according to the biblical account. You guys know this story. It's right before he's arrested and then crucified. And here's what Jonathan Edwards says about why Jesus was sweating. He says he was sweating because the door to the furnace had been opened, and he was about to walk in. The gospel is that Jesus is with us in our suffering, to carry us through, to save us. He goes into the fires before us. So the question is, what are the fires in your life right now, so to speak? Because today there's an encouragement and a reminder at a very general level that some of you need to hear today. And it's a message that's all throughout the scriptures. As you're going through trials and difficulties in your life as a believer, you're not alone. And you're not without hope. God is with you. Psalm 34:18, he's close to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. So when you do go into the fires in your life as a believer, we can always have that comfort and hope. God's with us. We're not alone in it. When you get the crushing news from the doctor, when you experience and carry that agony of watching a loved one's health journey play out. We just got some bad health news, more bad health news in some of our extended family just this week. And that stuff's just so brutal to watch loved ones go through this. It's heartbreaking. God is close to the heartbroken. When you're in the fires of the grind that is corporate America and the 8 to 5, 8 to 5, 8 to 5 repeat, and your coworkers are more than willing to stab you in the back, like the Chaldean astrologers in the story, to get ahead. And at times it feels like your very value and worth as a human being is solely based on your work performance. And it feels lonely. It feels like there's no one there with you in it. There is. God's with you in those fires as you live faithfully for him as work, as you endure and keep going, keep being a light in that workplace. When you're in the fires of a difficult marriage, God is with you. He can give you the strength that you need to keep going. When you're in the fires of parenting with little ones, and the mundane repetition of diapers again, and the same kids show again, and the same kids songs in the car again, and all of a sudden it's like, am I even like an adult anymore? I feel stuck in babyland, and it feels lonely. Look up, look to your right or your left, who's with you? You can lean on him, you can rely on him one day at a time. He gives you strength to do that. When you're in the fires of parenting teenagers, I don't even need to describe that one, As you are faithful to model and teach conviction and the importance of grace, God will help you. He's faithful, he's with you in that. If he can get these guys in the story through this furnace in Babylon, trust me, he can get you through your fires that you're facing. And of course, the main point of the whole story, when you endure the persecution that comes with godly nonconformity to the status quo, the social shame we carry in living Jesus' way, there's this beautiful promise we see in this story. Don't miss this, guys. The promise is this: when you, in your culture, when you stand for Jesus, Jesus is standing with you. He goes into the fires When we walk in, Jesus will be there to meet us inside. And as you do that, as you carry the ridicule and the awkwardness, I know it's awkward, okay? And the shame associated with living faithfully in a broken world, not only is God with you, but guess what? He's also going to use you for great things. What happened in the story as a result of their obedience and faithfulness under pressure? Worship of Yahweh is legalized in Babylon. Because these three men were faithful at a great cost, so many other people now will have the opportunity to experience God as a result. And guys, it works the same with God's people today. I know it's hard. I know it's awkward. I know sometimes you feel like a freak. But as you live the way of Jesus, one day at a time, as you say no to the pressure, one decision at a time, and say yes to living the way of Jesus, one day at a time, it might make some people around you furious, like King Nebuchadnezzar in the story. There might be people who don't like you. But some people around you are eventually going to say, tell me more. How do you have this hope in that kind of suffering? Tell me more about this love you have that's so unshallow. Tell me more about this joy you walk in where it doesn't even matter what circumstance you're going through. And God will use you for amazing things. Do you believe that? Let's go ahead and stand up. Would you pray with me? God, we come again to you with all of our imperfections, all the ways we fail, and we thank you for your amazing forgiveness, that grace just keeps covering us again and again as we come to you. And all of us, we wrestle with this stuff, and we fumble and fail at times. I pray that today would be a day where you would give us the courage to keep going, to keep trusting you, to keep choosing the way of Jesus over the way of culture. Would you give us courage, God, like you helped and were with these three men in the fire? Would you help us as we go out into our communities, our neighborhoods, our workplace, our school context this week, our friend circles? By your Spirit, would you protect us from caving in? Would you give us the strength we need to live in a way that others will see just how good you are and that they'd come to know your love? God, we think about how in the moments of social shame, it feels like a burden, but the reality is when we really understand your love, it's so not. You lighten the burden for us. You carry it for us. And so again, in worship today at the communion table, again, we're saying, today I've decided to follow Jesus. I'm choosing you again. I really do believe that your love and your hope is better than anything else that could be offered. So again, we choose you.